Hey, traveler. Tonight, I thought we'd talk about why you wouldn't last a day in the Mongol Empire. Where are you in the world right now? And what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. It's wonderful to know where our fellow travelers are joining us from tonight. Beneath the eternal blue sky, life wasn't exactly a picnic. What would you do if your alarm clock was the howling wind and your breakfast was, well, whatever you could find? Imagine a world without supermarkets, central heating, or even a comfy bed. If you've ever complained about a bad commute, try traversing the vast steppes on horseback, dodging bandits and battling the elements. Long before Amazon Prime, the Mongols had their own delivery system, the horse. Living a nomadic existence meant constant movement, following the herds and searching for greener pastures. Picture families packing up their yurts and belongings onto carts, embarking on journeys that could last for weeks or months. Now that's what I call extreme minimalism. The climate was brutal. Scorching summers gave way to frigid winters, and sudden sandstorms could engulf entire camps. Shelter was basic, consisting of felt tents offering minimal protection from the elements. If you're used to controlling your indoor climate with a thermostat, life on the steppe would feel like a perpetual endurance test. Imagine the static electricity. But medieval people, particularly the Mongols, were incredibly resourceful. They adapted to their environment by developing a deep understanding of animal husbandry, crafting durable clothing from animal hides, and mastering the art of archery. The difference was their lives depended on it. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was freezing to death or starving, a felt tent and a bow and arrow suddenly looked brilliant. Now that we've set the scene, let's talk about the importance of horses. A Mongol without a horse was like a modern person without a car, or maybe a smartphone. These animals were not just modes of transportation. They were companions, warriors, and essential tools for survival. What would you do if your social status depended entirely on your horse riding skills? From a young age, Mongol children learned to ride, hunt, and fight from horseback. They were practically born in the saddle. Imagine trying to keep up with a pack of seasoned riders when you can't even post. Speaking of horses, this brings us to the warrior culture that defined Mongol society. Warfare wasn't just a profession, it was a way of life. Constant tribal conflicts and raids meant that every Mongol male was expected to be a skilled fighter. This wasn't your average weekend warrior routine. This was a relentless commitment to martial prowess. Now, you might be thinking, okay, I can handle a bit of roughing it. I've been camping before. But living amongst the Mongols was more than just roughing it. It demanded unwavering loyalty to your clan, a deep respect for tradition, and an unyielding spirit in the face of adversity. Key takeaway: The Mongol lifestyle demanded extreme adaptability and resilience. But what good is survival without a little bit of spirituality? The early Mongols practiced shamanism, a belief system centered around the idea that spirits inhabited the natural world. Shamans acted as intermediaries between the human and spirit realms, performing rituals to appease the gods, heal the sick, and predict the future. Think of them as the ancient world's therapists, but with more chanting and animal sacrifices. So you'd be constantly moving, battling the elements, and adhering to a strict code of conduct. You'd also be expected to embrace a spiritual worldview that might seem foreign or even unsettling. Could you adapt to this existence before the empire even began? It's a tough question to answer. From tribal life to a global empire, medieval life required both adaptability and a good horse. These early experiences shaped the Mongols into the formidable force they would become, conquering vast territories and leaving an indelible mark on history.
Imagine trying to sleep tonight, knowing that waking up meant constant drilling, unrelenting discipline, and the very real possibility of dying for a man you've never even met. That was life in Genghis Khan's army. What would it be like to exist under such pressure? The Mongol army wasn't just a bunch of guys on horses. It was a finely tuned, terrifying machine. Think of it as the Navy SEALs of the 13th century, but with a whole lot more horses and a distinct lack of flippers. Their training regime would make even the toughest modern soldiers weep. Constant riding, archery practice until their fingers bled, and brutal hand-to-hand combat drills were the daily norm. Imagine a CrossFit class, but instead of burpees, you're disemboweling a dummy with a curved sword, and the instructor really means it when they say motivate each other. Discipline was everything. We complain about rush hour traffic, but Mongol soldiers faced penalties for the smallest infractions. A misplaced helmet, public flogging. Falling asleep on guard duty, execution. Think getting a parking ticket is bad? Try explaining to Genghis Khan why you were late to formation. Key takeaway: the Mongols didn't believe in second chances, only in efficient battle formations. Now that we've covered the intense training, let's delve into the organization. The Mongol army was structured using a decimal system, with units of 10, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s. It made it incredibly efficient and flexible. Imagine trying to manage a team of thousands using only spreadsheets and carrier pigeons. The Mongol system was far more effective, and each unit was responsible for the actions of the others. If one guy ran, the whole unit paid the price. Talk about peer pressure. Speaking of pressure, this brings us to the expectation to kill without hesitation. Modern soldiers grapple with PTSD, but for Mongol warriors, killing was just another Tuesday. They were taught to dehumanize their enemies, viewing them as obstacles rather than people. Morality took a back seat to victory. Think of it as the ultimate company mandate. Crush the competition, literally. Could you flip that switch, silencing your conscience and embracing the brutal realities of war? But what good is a brutal army without a leader to guide it? Genghis Khan wasn't just a conqueror, he was a master strategist and a charismatic leader. He understood logistics, psychology, and the art of manipulating his enemies. From strategy to the battlefield, the Mongol initial expansion was swift and devastating. They swept across Asia, leaving a trail of destruction and terror in their wake. Cities were razed, populations were slaughtered, and entire civilizations were brought to their knees. This wasn't just about conquering territory, it was about instilling fear. If you didn't surrender, you were going to regret it. Think of them as the ultimate collection agency, but instead of just taking your money, they took everything. The risk of enslavement was a constant threat. Captured populations were often forced into labor, serving the Mongol war machine. Imagine being ripped from your home and forced to build roads for the very people who destroyed your life. It was a cruel fate, and one that millions faced. But medieval people didn't have worker protection regulations. The difference was often the sharp edge of the sword. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was death, enslavement suddenly looked brilliant. Key takeaway: the Mongol Empire was all or nothing, total conquest or total annihilation. Now surviving the devastation left in the wake of the Mongol horde was no easy feat. Famine, disease, and widespread violence were rampant. It was a post-apocalyptic scenario, but without the cool leather jackets or zombie fighting skills. You'd have to scavenge for food, avoid roving bands of raiders, and pray that you didn't catch dysentery. Think The Walking Dead, but with more horses and less brain eating. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by a demanding job or a stressful situation, imagine facing the constant pressure, brutality, and uncertainty of life in the Mongol Empire.
Could you endure the training? Could you kill without hesitation? Could you survive the devastation? The answer, for most of us, is probably not, and that's a sobering thought. Key takeaway: the Mongol war machine was built on the backs of unwavering obedience and a willingness to embrace extreme violence. The Yasa was the law of the land in the Mongol Empire, a collection of decrees and regulations attributed to Genghis Khan. It was more than just a legal system. It was a way of life. What would it be like to live under a set of rules that were both absolute and often brutally enforced? Imagine a world where jaywalking could get you a public flogging. That was the reality under the yasa. The punishments were harsh and often disproportionate to the crime. Theft, treason, and even lying could result in severe consequences, including death. The yasa made the DMV seem like a day spa. Key takeaway: under the yasa, justice was swift, brutal, and rarely merciful. Now that we've covered the severity of the punishments, let's talk about the scope of the yasa. It governed every aspect of life, from military conduct to religious practices, to even how you slaughtered livestock. There was no room for ambiguity or interpretation. The yasa was the law, and you either followed it or faced the consequences. Think of it as the ultimate terms and conditions agreement, but you can't just click, "I agree." Speaking of things you might accidentally agree to, this brings us to the crimes that wouldn't even be considered crimes today. Criticizing the Khan, being wasteful, or even failing to show proper respect could all land you in hot water. Imagine getting arrested for accidentally throwing away a perfectly good bread crust. The yasa was like having a really strict, really angry hall monitor watching your every move. But what good is a legal system without enforcement? The yasa was enforced by a network of officials and soldiers who were given absolute authority to carry out its dictates. There was no appeal process, no jury of your peers, and no get-out-of-jail-free card. You were at the mercy of the enforcers. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of RoboCop, but with more horses and less empathy. The difference was the speed of judgment. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was anarchy, the yasa suddenly looked brilliant. From enforcement to its impact, the yasa provided both order and fear within the growing empire. It created a society that was vastly different from settled civilizations, where laws were often debated and interpreted. The yasa was simple: obey or suffer. It was effective, but it came at a cost. Think of it as the ultimate example of tough love, but with a whole lot more toughness and a distinct lack of love. If you've ever tried to navigate a complex legal system, imagine trying to navigate one where the rules are arbitrary, the punishments are severe, and there's no room for error. Could you adapt to such a system? Could you live in constant fear of accidentally breaking the law? Could you reconcile your own sense of justice with the brutal realities of the yasa? These are questions worth pondering, especially when you find yourself tossing and turning at 3 a.m. Key takeaway: the yasa ensured order through fear, creating a society where even unintentional infractions could have severe consequences. Now let's consider the complex religious policies and the use of terror tactics. How could seemingly contradictory ideas exist side by side within the Mongol Empire? The Mongol Empire was surprisingly tolerant of different religions, unlike many other empires of the time. They didn't force conversions or persecute people for their beliefs. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and others were allowed to practice their faiths freely. Think of it as the ultimate example of religious pluralism, but with a strong undercurrent of don't even think about rebelling. Speaking of rebellion, this brings us to the darker side of the Mongol Empire. While they may have tolerated different religions, any form of resistance or disobedience was met with unimaginable cruelty. Cities that resisted were razed to the ground, and their populations were often slaughtered or enslaved. The Mongols were basically saying, "We'll let you worship whatever you want, as long as you do exactly what we say." Imagine a daycare that lets you choose your toys, but punishes you severely for coloring outside the lines. Tolerance and terror, an odd couple. The Mongols understood that a happy populace was less likely to rebel. But the threat of violence was always there, lurking beneath the surface. It was a delicate balance, and one that required a certain amount of mental gymnastics to accept. This was the ultimate carrot and stick approach, but the stick was a spiked club. From these policies, we see the complexities of navigating daily life. Imagine you're a devout Christian living in a Mongol-controlled city. You're free to worship, but you also know that any hint of defiance could bring down the wrath of the entire empire. You're constantly walking a tightrope, balancing your faith with the need to survive. But medieval life didn't have the luxury of social media for help and support. The difference was constant vigilance. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was religious persecution, the Mongol system suddenly looked brilliant. Key takeaway: religious tolerance coexisted with the constant threat of brutal reprisal, creating a society of complex moral compromises. If you've ever struggled with cognitive dissonance, imagine living in a society where religious freedom exists alongside the constant threat of violence. Could you reconcile these contradictions? Could you adapt to a world where tolerance is conditional and obedience is paramount? These are questions that might keep you up at night, long after the lights are turned off. It was always about the stories of people caught between these forces and surviving. Now, imagine life on the Silk Road. The Mongol Empire had a significant impact on trade and communication along this vital artery of commerce. Were the opportunities worth the peril? The Mongol Empire brought a period of relative peace and stability to the Silk Road, which led to increased trade and cultural exchange. Merchants, diplomats, and travelers could move more freely and safely than before. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of the European Union, but with a lot more camels and a distinct lack of paperwork. Speaking of danger, this brings us to the perils of the Silk Road. Banditry, disease, and political instability were still very real threats. Traveling across vast distances was risky, and there was no guarantee that you'd make it to your destination alive. It was like the Wild West, but with more silk and fewer cowboys. Imagine a long-haul trucking route with pirates and the plague. But what about the realities of disease in the 13th century? Sanitation was virtually non-existent, and medical knowledge was limited.
A simple infection could easily turn deadly. Imagine having a bad toothache and knowing that your only option is to have it pulled by a blacksmith. You'd need some serious meditation to calm down for that one. From sanitation to travel, how would your life change as a merchant on the Silk Road? You'd be exposed to new cultures, new ideas, and new opportunities. But you'd also be at constant risk of disease, robbery, and political intrigue. It was a high-stakes game with potentially huge rewards and devastating consequences. The difference was the absence of modern sanitation and germ theory. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was isolated subsistence, the Silk Road suddenly looked brilliant. Key takeaway: the Silk Road offered both opportunity and danger, creating a world of constant risk and potential reward. If you've ever felt the allure of adventure or the thrill of the unknown, imagine navigating the Silk Road in the 13th century. Would you be willing to risk your life for the chance to make a fortune? Would you be able to adapt to the constant dangers and uncertainties? These are the questions that haunt those of us who ponder history late into the night. Finally, the Mongol Empire eventually fractured, leading to infighting and eventual collapse. How would the empire's dissolution affect your hypothetical survival? The Mongol Empire, once a seemingly unstoppable force, eventually began to decline. Internal conflicts, succession disputes, and economic problems weakened the empire from within. Think of it as a corporate merger gone horribly wrong, with backstabbing, power struggles, and massive layoffs. Speaking of impact, the Mongols left a lasting legacy on world history, both positive and negative. They facilitated trade and cultural exchange, but they also instilled a legacy of fear and violence. Their impact can still be felt today, centuries after their empire crumbled. The difference was the lack of a central authority to maintain order. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was constant war, the fragmented Mongol states suddenly looked brilliant. Even as the empire crumbles, what lasting lessons can be learned from this period of history? The Mongol Empire teaches us about the importance of leadership, the power of organization, and the dangers of unchecked ambition. It's a cautionary tale, reminding us that even the most powerful empires can eventually fall. If you've ever witnessed the rise and fall of a company or a political movement, imagine experiencing the collapse of the Mongol Empire. How would you adapt to the chaos and uncertainty? What lessons would you learn from this experience? How would its eventual dissolution affect your hypothetical survival, and maybe even change the course of your life forever? These are the questions that keep historians up at night,
And now perhaps they'll keep you up too. The empire crumbled, but the legacies of culture and terror remained.
Imagine, if you will, trading your comfortable bed for a straw-stuffed mattress, your gourmet coffee for, well, let's just say the Mongol Empire wasn't exactly known for its barista-quality beverages. Could you survive? Probably not. Now, let's explore why. The Mongol Empire, a realm forged in the fires of conquest, sprawled across vast swaths of Asia in the 13th and 14th centuries. Think of it as the world's largest, most terrifying and strangely efficient startup, but with significantly less employee benefits. Getting a dental plan? Forget about it. So, what was it like? First off, personal hygiene. You know how you complain when your shower is lukewarm for 5 seconds? In the Mongol Empire, bathing was a rare luxury. Water was scarce in many areas, and resources were prioritized for more essential things, like, conquering new territories. Basically, you were trading cleanliness for the ability to pillage and plunder. Key takeaway? Hygiene standards were significantly lower than what you're used to. Imagine the body odor. Now that we've covered the olfactory nightmare that was the Mongol Empire, let's talk about food. Ever complain about airplane food? You would be absolutely begging for a microwaved Salisbury steak after a week on the Mongol diet. While they were master horsemen and warriors, Mongol cuisine was rather limited. Meat, primarily mutton or horse, was the staple. Vegetables were scarce, especially in the steppe regions. Preparation methods were often rudimentary. Think boiled meat, grilled meat, and, well, more meat. Forget your trendy vegan options. The difference was that survival was the key, and fancy culinary arts were not prioritized. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when the alternative was starvation, boiled mutton suddenly looked amazing. Key takeaway? Food was about sustenance, not satisfaction. Speaking of sustenance, this brings us to disease. Got a headache? Pop an ibuprofen. In the Mongol Empire, you'd be relying on questionable herbal remedies and the questionable skills of a shaman. Medical knowledge was limited, and sanitation was practically non-existent. Diseases like the plague spread rapidly, decimating populations. The Black Death, in fact, likely traveled along Mongol trade routes. Imagine the existential dread of a sniffle. The difference was that access to antibiotics and vaccines were simply not a thing. Sure, they had some traditional medicine, but when you are facing bubonic plague, your chances are slim. Key takeaway? Disease was a constant and deadly threat. But what good is survival without some sort of social structure? Let's discuss the legal system. Speeding ticket? Lawyer up. In the Mongol Empire, justice was swift, brutal, and often arbitrary. The legal code, known as the yasa, was a set of decrees issued by Genghis Khan. Punishments ranged from fines to public floggings to execution.
The severity of the punishment often depended on the whim of the local governor or military commander. There was not much nuance or legal precedent. The difference was due process was non-existent, and individual rights were unheard of. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was complete anarchy, swift justice suddenly seemed preferable. Key takeaway? The legal system was harsh and unpredictable. From legal systems to military life, because, let's face it, the Mongol Empire was built on conquest. Ever spent a day at the office wishing you were anywhere else? Imagine spending years on horseback, enduring grueling campaigns, facing constant danger. Mongol warriors were renowned for their skill, discipline, and endurance. However, life as a soldier was incredibly demanding. Training was rigorous, discipline was harsh, and the risks were immense. Sure, there was the promise of plunder and glory, but the reality was often hardship and death. Think of it as the ultimate sink-or-swim work environment. Key takeaway? Military life was brutal and demanding. Now that we've covered military life, let's talk about daily life. You know how you value your free time? In the Mongol Empire, free time was a rare and precious commodity. Most people were engaged in agriculture, animal husbandry, or other forms of manual labor. Days were long and arduous, and comforts were few. There was little in the way of entertainment or leisure activities. Think of it as living in a perpetual state of hustle culture, but without the motivational podcasts. Key takeaway? Daily life was a constant struggle for survival. So, could you last a day in the Mongol Empire? Probably not. The lack of hygiene, the harsh diet, the constant threat of disease, the brutal legal system, and the demanding lifestyle would likely overwhelm you. You would quickly find yourself longing for the comforts of modern life, like running water, antibiotics, and, well, basic human rights. But hey, at least you would have some epic stories to tell, if you survived.
The wind whispers tales of forgotten empires, doesn't it? And tonight it carries a chilling one, the Mongol Empire. Imagine a land stretching from the Pacific to Eastern Europe, ruled by warriors on horseback. Sounds epic, right? But what if you had to live there? What if your cozy, climate-controlled existence was traded for survival in a harsh, unforgiving world? You wouldn't last a day. Probably. I mean, unless you're secretly a descendant of Genghis Khan. If so, carry on. So, you think you're tough? You binge-watch survival shows and complain about Wi-Fi. The Mongol Empire would laugh, loudly. They were a society built on resilience, brutality, and a surprising amount of logistical genius. Getting up early for work is hard. Try getting up early to prepare for a raid on a neighboring tribe. See, now your Monday doesn't look so bad, does it? Let's start with the basics. Food. Today we complain about organic kale shortages. Back then it was, will I even find food? The Mongol diet was heavily meat-based, relying on livestock. Think mutton, horse meat, and dairy products. Vegetables? Scarce. Fruit? A luxury. Processed foods?
Unless you count fermented mare's milk as processed, then no. Airag, by the way, is an acquired taste. Imagine sour yogurt, slightly alcoholic, and potentially horse-flavored. Delicious. Key takeaway: food was fuel, not a foodie experience. Now that we've covered sustenance, let's talk about shelter. If you're imagining cozy cottages with fireplaces, think again. The Mongols' primary dwelling was the gur, a portable, circular tent. Practical, yes. Luxurious, not so much. Imagine camping, but permanently. And instead of a comfy sleeping bag, you have a felt mat on the ground. Insulation, provided by layers of animal hides and, of course, the body heat of your family. The difference was there wasn't a hardware store or Amazon delivery around. Survival required constant adaptation. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was sleeping exposed to the elements, a gur was a palace. Key takeaway: home was where you hung your hat and your yak hide. Speaking of shelter, this brings us to clothing. Forget your breathable fabrics and stylish designs. Mongol clothing was all about functionality. Layers of heavy wool and animal skins were essential for protection against the harsh climate. Think itchy sweaters, but constantly. And don't forget the boots, sturdy leather creations designed for riding. Ever try walking long distances in those things? Blisters guaranteed. Fashion was function, not for expression. You'd wear layers of whatever you can to protect yourself from the elements. But what good is warmth without hygiene? Modern people can hop into a hot shower whenever they want. But medieval people, not so much. Bathing was a rare event. Water was scarce, and hygiene wasn't exactly a top priority when survival was on the line. Imagine the smell. Combine that with the animal hides, the fermented milk, and the general lack of deodorant. Let's just say personal space was probably a necessity, not a social construct. The difference was in the knowledge of germs. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was dying from infection, a little dirt seemed like a small price to pay. Key takeaway: cleanliness was next to impossible. From personal hygiene to sanitation. You know how we have sewage systems.
Waste disposal was less sophisticated. Basically, you dug a hole and hoped for the best. Disease spread rapidly. Infections were common. Medical care was primitive. Think herbal remedies and prayers, not antibiotics and hospitals. A simple cut could turn deadly. A fever could be a death sentence. Hope you've got a strong immune system. Key takeaway: health was a gamble you might lose. Okay, so you're smelly, uncomfortable, and potentially diseased. But hey, at least you're safe, right? Wrong. The Mongol Empire was built on warfare. Raids, battles, conquests. It was a constant state of conflict. Men were expected to be warriors. Women were expected to support them. Children were raised to be tough. Ever try shooting a bow from horseback? It's harder than it looks, trust me. Warfare was not
for the faint of heart. The Mongol army was known for its discipline, its mobility, and its sheer ruthlessness. There wasn't much in the way of mercy. I mean, you would probably spend all your time trying to survive, only to be raided and killed. Key takeaway: peace was a distant memory. But what good is warfare without strategy? The Mongol army was highly organized and utilized sophisticated tactics. They were masters of deception, feigned retreats, and coordinated attacks. Ever played a strategy game? Imagine that, but with real lives on the line. Information was key. Messengers traveled vast distances, relaying orders and intelligence. They had a rudimentary postal system, the yam, which allowed for rapid communication. The Mongols understood the importance of logistics and communication. The result? Conquering much of Asia and Europe in one of the biggest contiguous land empires in history. Key takeaway: victory required brains and brawn. So, now you're a smelly, uncomfortable, potentially diseased warrior, constantly on the move and always at risk of death. Sound appealing? Probably not. But the Mongol Empire wasn't all doom and gloom. There were some surprising aspects of their society. For example, they were relatively tolerant of different religions. They valued trade and promoted economic growth. They even had a written legal code, the Yasa, which aimed to maintain order and justice. When your goal is to rule the world, you need some kind of order. It wasn't a utopia by any means, but it wasn't a complete dystopia either. Key takeaway: empire building wasn't only about brute force. The Mongol Empire was a complex and fascinating civilization. It was a world of extremes, where survival was a constant struggle, and where life could be brutal and short. But it was also a world of innovation, resilience, and cultural exchange. It's a world that's difficult for modern people to truly comprehend. We're so accustomed to comfort and convenience that the challenges faced by the Mongols seem almost unimaginable. So, the next time you're complaining about your slow internet or your lukewarm coffee, take a moment to appreciate the relative ease of your life. Because trust me, you wouldn't last a day in the Mongol Empire. Unless, of course, you have a horse and a really big sword, and a high tolerance for fermented mare's milk. Key takeaway: appreciate your life, even with its minor inconveniences. You're going to need that health insurance.
Imagine a world without the internet, without readily available medicine, where the threat of violence lingered around every corner. Now, try to imagine surviving there. You wouldn't last a day in the Mongol Empire, would you? The Mongol Empire, a colossal landmass stretching from Eastern Europe to the Sea of Japan in the 13th and 14th centuries, was a marvel of military might and surprisingly sophisticated governance. But beneath the veneer of organized chaos and trade routes lay a harsh reality, a daily gauntlet that would leave a modern individual utterly bewildered. Think of rush-hour traffic, the bane of modern existence. Now picture that, but on horseback, with the added pressure of potentially being conscripted into a world-conquering army at any moment. Your Uber driver has a bad day? Try dealing with a Mongol warlord who just lost his favorite falcon. Good luck with that. One of the first hurdles would be the food. Forget your artisanal sourdough and meticulously sourced avocados. Your diet would consist primarily of meat, often dried or preserved in less than appetizing ways. Arag, fermented mare's milk, was a staple. It's an acquired taste. Imagine kombucha, but with a distinctly barnyard flavor. Delicious? Debatable. Nutritious? Absolutely necessary. Key takeaway: survival often trumped culinary delight. Hygiene, or the distinct lack thereof, would be another rude awakening. Forget daily showers and readily available hand sanitizer. Water was precious, and bathing was a luxury. Lice, fleas, and a host of other unwelcome guests would become your constant companions. You might be thinking, I'll just use some essential oils. Good luck finding lavender in the Gobi Desert. Speaking of which, the nomadic lifestyle meant constant travel, sleeping in yurts that offered minimal protection from the elements and even less from the pervasive dust and grime. Key takeaway: cleanliness was a concept, not a reality. Then there's the legal system, or rather the lack of due process. The Mongol Empire operated under a strict code of laws known as the Yasa, attributed to Genghis Khan. While it promoted order and punished wrongdoing, its application was often swift and brutal. Stealing a horse could mean death. Insulting a superior, death. Accidentally tripping over Genghis Khan's rug, you get the picture. Modern legal systems offer appeals and lengthy trials. The Mongol system offered swift judgment, often delivered with a sword. Key takeaway: justice was efficient, but not always fair. But it wasn't all grim. The Mongol Empire was a melting pot of cultures and religions. Tolerance was often practiced, allowing various faiths to coexist. Trade flourished along the Silk Road, bringing goods and ideas from distant lands. However, even this cultural exchange came with risks. Disease traveled as easily as silk and spices. A simple cold could turn into a deadly epidemic, and your modern immune system, pampered by antibiotics and vaccinations, wouldn't stand a chance against the plagues that periodically swept through the empire. Imagine your worst flu symptoms, then multiply them by 10 and add the constant fear of death. Key takeaway: cultural exchange came with a hefty price tag. Warfare was a constant threat. The Mongol army was renowned for its speed, discipline, and ruthlessness. Military service was often compulsory, and you could find yourself conscripted into a campaign at any moment. Picture being snatched from your comfortable couch and thrust onto a horse, armed with a bow and arrow, and ordered to conquer a distant city. Your knowledge of spreadsheets and social media marketing wouldn't be particularly useful. Key takeaway: peace was a rare commodity. Now that we've covered the grim realities of daily life, let's talk about the social hierarchy. While the Mongol Empire offered opportunities for advancement based on merit, social mobility was still limited. If you weren't born into a noble family or didn't possess exceptional skills, your options were limited. Imagine trying to climb the corporate ladder in a system where the CEO's son automatically gets promoted over you, regardless of your qualifications. Frustrating, isn't it? Key takeaway: social climbing was a risky endeavor. Speaking of social structures, this brings us to the role of women. While Mongol women enjoyed more freedom and influence than their counterparts in many other societies of the time, their lives were still far from easy. They managed households, raised children, and even participated in warfare. However, they were still subject to the authority of men and lacked the same rights and opportunities. Modern women face plenty of challenges in the workplace, but at least they don't have to worry about leading a raiding party while simultaneously breastfeeding a baby. Key takeaway: gender equality was a distant dream. From food scarcity to the constant threat of violence, life in the Mongol Empire was a far cry from the comforts and conveniences of modern society. You wouldn't last a day, not because you're weak, but because you're accustomed to a world that values safety, hygiene, and personal freedom. The Mongol Empire valued strength, resilience, and obedience. It was a world of extremes, a place where survival was a daily struggle, and where the slightest misstep could have fatal consequences. So next time you're complaining about your Wi-Fi being slow, remember the Mongol Empire and be grateful for the relatively peaceful and comfortable life you lead. And maybe appreciate that kombucha just a little bit more.
The wind whispers outside, doesn't it? Makes you think about other nights, other lives. Tonight, we're diving headfirst into a world utterly unlike our own, the Mongol Empire. What would you do if you suddenly found yourself transported back to the 13th century, smack dab in the middle of Genghis Khan's sprawling domain? Life wouldn't exactly be a picnic. Imagine trading your comfy mattress for a bumpy ride on a horse, your endless streaming options for the vast, unforgiving steppes. Long before Netflix binges, there was simply surviving. First off, forget your meticulously curated diet. Food safety regulations, non-existent. Your average Mongol meal might consist of arog, boiled meat, and maybe some dried curds if you were lucky. Variety was not the spice of life, survival was. Key takeaway: Mongol cuisine was about sustenance, not culinary artistry. And speaking of mutton, hope you like it a lot. Vegetarians wouldn't fare well. The vast distances and nomadic lifestyle meant vegetables were a rare luxury. But what about salad, you might ask? Picture a bewildered Mongol warrior staring back at you. Salad? That's what the horses eat. Now that we've covered the culinary delights, let's talk about hygiene. Remember those long, hot showers you enjoy? Yeah, scratch those. Bathing was infrequent, to say the least. Water was a precious resource, and cleanliness wasn't exactly a top priority when you were constantly on the move. Forget about deodorant, too. The natural aroma of horse, sweat, and mutton would be your signature scent. The difference was that medieval people were used to it. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was dying of dysentery, a little body odor suddenly looked brilliant. Speaking of hygiene, this brings us to the topic of medicine. Got a headache? Toothache? Hope you have a high pain tolerance because your options were limited. Forget antibiotics, MRIs, or even aspirin. Medieval medicine relied heavily on herbal remedies, superstition, and a healthy dose of luck. Got a nasty wound?
A shaman might try chanting over it while you pray to whatever gods you can remember. Key takeaway: medical care was a gamble, and the odds weren't in your favor. Let's consider another charming aspect: the legal system. Imagine accidentally bumping into a high-ranking Mongol official. In our modern legal system, you might face a fine or a minor charge. But in the Mongol Empire, depending on the severity of the offense, you could face anything from a public flogging to, well, decapitation. Laws were harsh, punishments swift, and justice often arbitrary. But what good is food, hygiene, and fair treatment without a roof over your head? Forget your cozy apartment with central heating and a reliable Wi-Fi signal. Your typical Mongol dwelling was a gur, a portable, circular tent made of felt. It was practical, easy to transport, and surprisingly resilient in the harsh steppe climate. But it wasn't exactly luxurious. The difference was that while we expect climate-controlled comfort, Mongolians had to move a lot. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was freezing to death on the open plains, a felt tent suddenly looked brilliant. Key takeaway: your home moved with you, but lacked indoor plumbing. And speaking of roofs, this brings us to the constant threat of war. The Mongol Empire was built on conquest. Raids, battles, and sieges were a constant reality. As a subject of the Khan, you could be conscripted into the army at any time. Forget about your career aspirations or your weekend plans. Your new job was riding into battle, facing down enemy armies, and possibly dying for the glory of the Mongol Empire. Before video games about war, there was just actual war. Now that we've covered the grim realities, let's consider communication. Forget your smartphones, emails, and social media. News traveled slowly, often by word of mouth or via mounted messengers. Staying in touch with loved ones was a challenge, and information was often unreliable. You might hear rumors of a great victory or a devastating defeat, but knowing the truth was another matter entirely. From homes to health, let's also think about career prospects. Forget your fancy job title and your corner office. In the Mongol Empire, your career options were somewhat limited. You could be a herder, a soldier, a craftsman, or if you were really lucky, a scribe. But most likely, you'd be tending to livestock, moving from pasture to pasture, and living a life of nomadic simplicity. Your alternative was starving. Key takeaway: your job was tied to survival. And lastly, let's think about what you would wear. Say goodbye to fashion and hello to practicality. Your wardrobe would consist of sturdy, functional clothing made from wool, leather, and animal hides. Forget designer labels and trendy outfits. Your primary concern would be staying warm, dry, and protected from the elements. Comfort was a bonus, not a requirement. Forget synthetic materials and breathable fabrics. Your clothes would be heavy, scratchy, and probably smelled faintly of animal fat. As our brief glimpse into the Mongol Empire concludes, we find that while their empire was vast and powerful, life for the average person was a constant struggle for survival. It certainly would have been a far cry from our modern comforts and conveniences. But here's the thing: the Mongol Empire, with all its harshness, was also a place of incredible innovation and cultural exchange. They established a vast postal system, promoted trade along the Silk Road, and fostered religious tolerance. They conquered, but they also connected.
And now, as the night deepens, we conclude our journey into this challenging yet fascinating era. Thank you for accompanying me through these quiet explorations. May your dreams be a little more comfortable and a little less Mongol.